Thanks, Bob, and for that very gracious introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be with you all here today in Atlanta, and the weather's cooperating, so it was a very pleasant flight down from Washington. So thank you all very much for coming. And like Kelly was saying, this is a really important topic. It's a federal topic, but I think it's one that affects everybody here in Atlanta as around the country and literally around the world, which we'll get into here in a few minutes. And so my colleague at AEI, Peter Wallison, and I are going to try to cover a fair amount of ground here in a short amount of time. And so, like Kelly was saying, the Dodd-Frank Act is similar very much to the the Affordable Care Act, its official name. Both are about 2,400 pages long. So there are about twice as many words in Dodd-Frank as in the Bible, literally, and so there are a number of titles of Dodd-Frank, 15 some odd titles, but unlike Obamacare, Dodd-Frank covers a broad range of things, and there were a lot of little gimmies to all of the different interest groups that the majority in power in Congress and the White House at the time wanted to please. So I compare Obamacare to sort of if you know that puzzle called Jenga, where you have this stack of blocks and you start pulling out and you see how many you can pull out without the whole thing collapsing. Well, Obamacare does have parts that if you keep on tugging at them, it will collapse, and I have confidence that it will over time as it proves unworkable. But Dodd-Frank is different. It just, as I said, it's this broad approach, and each one of the, or many of the provisions of it basically stand alone. But I wanted to talk about one of the main parts, and like Kelly said, the Journal had a great editorial in Tuesday's paper about one aspect of it, and that's how it affects insurance companies. And this is an ancillary part of it that affects asset managers, but it's the same principle that affects insurance companies and others. And so if you go back to 2008, when we had the financial crisis, Dodd-Frank, of course, was an outgrowth of that, and Peter is going to get into some of the whys and hows and wherefores. But let's just say that coming out of that financial crisis, no one ever sat down and said what happened and why did this crisis come about. Peter was on a body that attempted to do it, although it was kind of ill-fated from the start. We'll get into that later. But coming out of the financial crisis, there was this mentality that it was government that was not at fault. It was the private sector, the greed on Wall Street, people rolling the dice in the casino there, and they built this house of cards that then collapsed. And so what needed to happen is that the government needed to come in, and it had to enforce stability in the marketplace. And it was basically, I like to call it stability über alles. Basically, that is the one thing that all the regulators need to aim for, is to have everything be smooth and none of these big gyrations in the marketplace. But as you all know, if you have to do anything with the capital markets or the market in general, markets are inherently unstable. They cannot be stable because they're driven by people, and people are not necessarily stable. We'd like them to be, but people are powered by the 7 deadly sins and virtues as well. But because of all that mix, the marketplace has its inevitable ups and downs, but because it does, it ultimately is smoothed out, because whereas one person gets freaked out by a particular type of risk or something that he's afraid of or greedy about or whatever, or overpays or whatnot, there's somebody on the other side of that transaction, and that is what is the brilliance of the invisible hand in the market. Well, folks in Washington don't necessarily agree with that or believe in it. And at least the ones who were in power back in 2010, and so that's why we had the Dodd-Frank Act be adopted. So one of the provisions of Dodd-Frank is Title I, and it's called financial stability. And it's no surprise that what was born out of this was there was an idea, let's get all the smart people in the room, and they can think deep thoughts, peer into their crystal balls into the future, and they will be able to financial bubbles before they come about. Well, I think this is just a fool's errand, frankly, because you cannot get enough information and enough smart people in the room to be able to figure this out. And Friedrich von Hayek pointed this out very well in his very last book, which he called Fatal Conceit. And he said the fatal conceit in Washington is that you can get enough smart people in the room and get enough information, and they will be able to outwit the billions of people who are literally transacting on a daily or every second basis. So what was born out of this was the idea, well, let's get the heads of the various regulators together. They can talk about what's going on. They can share experiences, and they can try to coordinate what their activities of their various agencies are. So there was born this thing called the Financial Stability Oversight Council. There's the keyword stability. It's kind of like what had gone on before in the wake of long-term capital management in the late 90s. That was a hedge fund that blew up and created a bit of instability in the financial markets. But what was born out of that was called the President's Working Group on Financial Markets. It was kind of a chatting session where the heads of the SEC, CFTC, the Fed, and other regulatory agencies got around to talk about their various approaches. This basically put that on steroids and put a general framework in the statute around it, gave the Treasury Secretary the chairmanship of the agencies of this particular group, and gave them a veto power over what this group would decide about. And this group can direct individual agencies to do different things, and we've seen that here recently with respect to money market mutual funds, which I won't necessarily go into now, but that's an example of how this group can drive the policy of a particular agency, in that case the SEC. So basically, as you notice here, most of the people around the table, a majority of them are bank regulators. There's one insurance representative. The federal government doesn't regulate insurance companies, the states do, but the statute gives the president the authority to appoint an insurance representative. In this case, or he would all used to be the Kentucky insurance state regulator. So the FSOC basically is very secretive. Their meetings are not open to the public. They have very broad powers. They can declare companies, financial companies that are non-banks and not necessarily regulated by any of these particular agencies to be problematic, and they have abilities to regulate them almost on an ad hoc basis. If you are designated by this particular group to be a significant financial institution, and you want to dispute that designation, because then you get you will be subject to regulation by the Fed, which is of course one of the members of it. You have very limited judicial recourse. You can go to the courts and protest, but the judge is prohibited by statute to look at why the agency, why the FSOC designated it. They could only look, the judge can only tell if the agency acted in an arbitrary and capricious manner, which is a very narrow ambit for the judge to look at. Because the Treasury Secretary is the head of this particular group, it really then gives the White House direct control over what had been up to now independent agencies in Washington, the SEC, CFTC, the control of the currency, and others. So the one case in point, and this was covered in the Journal's editorial on Tuesday, is the power of this FSOC to designate particular institutions to be systemically important. They started off by the statute authorizes them to designate banks with more than $50 billion in assets as being systemically important. And so, for example, SunTrust with $175 billion or whatever in assets is one of those systemically important financial institutions. And it goes on down. Zions Bank, I think, is the smallest at about $50 billion. Then they started looking at other sorts of companies, and one of the areas was insurance. They designated right off Prudential Insurance, but The insurance expert on the panel, the only one with insurance expertise among these 10 members, Roy Woodall, whom I mentioned earlier, dissented very vociferously from this particular designation, saying that basically his colleagues didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what insurance regulation was all about. They were ill-equipped to do it, and none of this really made any sense to them. So that's pretty problematic, I think, if the president's own insurance appointee disputes what the other regulators have just voted to do. And so now they are starting to talk about asset managers, and that's really what I wanted to focus on here for the next few minutes, because asset management is regulated by the SEC. They are mutual funds and other registered investment advisors manage people's assets. They're not like banks, and we'll go into that in a few minutes. But the Financial Stability Oversight Council is trying to look at ways that they can bring stability to the marketplace, and they are worried that asset managers may have what they call a herding instinct. That means that all the asset managers might decide one day to go into bonds, the next day to sell out of bonds and go into some sort of equity securities, and on the third day go into something else. So they're worried of this herding instinct. They're worried about just not understanding what's going on in the asset management world. So there's an office that was set up by Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank incidentally set up 13 new offices and agencies and only got rid of one. So you can tell that the taxpayer came out of that score. But the Office of Financial Research, which came out with, it's a handmaiden of the Treasury Department and the Fed. But it came out with a report in September of last year, which basically sort of laid the basis for a rationale of regulating asset managers like banks. But this report is being castigated by all sorts of people as being not well informed. There were lots of mistakes in the report, even factual mistakes. And so I would not hold it up as a paradigm of government study. But this is meant to sort of lay the groundwork of now looking at asset management as a place to extend this oversight by the FSOC. If we go back to the legislative history of the Dodd-Frank Act, there was a lot of discussion as to what the powers of the Fed and what the powers of this Oversight Council would be. And in fact, there on the floor of the Senate, there was a discussion between, at the time, Senator Kerry and Senator Dodd about how asset management would not be part of this whole regulatory scheme. What we have then, the statute sets up various attributes of what they thought might be systemically important financial institutions, and no surprise is size is one of the things that the statute talked about. But if we look at, for example, the statute is focused on banks primarily, and now, of course, as I was saying, we're talking about perhaps extending this type of regulation to asset managers. But if you compare the size of, say, the largest of the banks, and here even the very largest bank has about $2 trillion of assets, the largest U.S. bank. But if you look at the largest of them, it's about $1.28 trillion of assets. But the largest investment funds are just a fraction of that, a little bit larger than SunTrust, but at $159 billion. So if you compare the size of, say, the largest of the average of the banks at $1.28 trillion, and look at the Peachtree Plaza downtown at 70-some stories or whatever, 1,000 feet high. Compare that to the Tabernacle, which is about 8 stories high. And so you get the difference between size of asset managers versus banks. If we look at another one of the rubrics that the statute talks about is substitutability, you can see how much more the banking system is there we go is concentrated than is the asset management industry. Another rubric that the statute talks about is a thing called interconnectedness, meaning like, well, if one fails, then somebody else down the street may fail because of the instability in the marketplace. Well, asset managers are a lot different than banks. Banks basically take in deposits from people, and then they use those deposits and their shareholders' equity to lever up, basically, and for every dollar they may lend out 12 to 15 or so, or perhaps even more. Asset managers basically take in a dollar and lend it out. And you can see that in the leverage ratios of banks, which is in some cases way over 20% as well. But if we see here is a little cartoon where depositors put in their dollar into the bank, and then the bank, as I said, makes loans on a long-term basis, usually to people who are buying houses, building factories or office buildings, and over time, of course, the bank is hoping to make a profit on that and then be able to pay interest on the deposits that are in the institution and, of course, pay back the loans. Asset managers take in a dollar from their investors, and then they basically invest the dollar into securities on the other side. And so there's not this kind of threat of mismatch that we see in the banking industry that is powering some of the concern by the bank regulators in their approach. Asset managers, of course, are regulated by all sorts of agencies, primarily the SEC, the CFTC is another, and the states as well. But the main sort of thing that we need to be concerned about is what will a bank-type regulatory approach, because that's what we're talking about at the end. If the Financial Stability Oversight Council starts to designate asset management firms or mutual funds or the whole activity, perhaps, of asset management as being systemically important, what is going to be the effect on the economy and on investors? And so basically what we're afraid of is that investors are ultimately going to have to pick up the tab of this extra level of regulation. There'll be higher costs, there'll be fewer investment choices, and what's I think even more concerning is that under Dodd-Frank there's Section 220, which basically says that among these institutions that are designated as systemically important, that if there be a failure of, say, a large bank or of one of these large systemically important financial institutions, that the other institutions then will be required to pay into a fund that would then be used in the bailout or whatever the resolution of the failed entity. So now we have the prospect of mutual fund investors or others having to pony up for whatever may be needed or desired by the government to do in the event of a resolution of a big institution. So why really are we having this discussion? And so I think part of it is because the Federal Reserve has always been very leery of what's going on with respect to the markets as a whole and with respect to asset managers. They're very comfortable, of course, regulating banks with their whole rubric of what's called safety and soundness, because they're looking to the soundness of the financial institution. They're not necessarily looking out for for investors themselves. So I think what we're seeing here is this traditional battle between the SEC type of approach of regulation with respect to disclosure in the marketplace and that sort of thing versus the way the Federal Reserve approaches it. But some people have suggested that there might even be a different motivation by the Fed, and so I don't want to come up with any conspiracy theories. But if you look at what the box that the Fed has put itself in now with zero interest rates for a number of years, they're going to have to raise them over time. The market ultimately will force them to change their policy. And so wouldn't it be nice if some control could be extended over the marketplace, so maybe the market wouldn't be in such turmoil once they start to change their policy. So the powers that they would have if this Financial Stability Oversight Council would start to designate asset management as an activity or asset managers as such, they might be able to control dispositions of assets, what sort of assets could be invested in, timing of dispositions or acquisitions, that sort of thing. So the prospect of what we're looking at here of much more central planning in the capital markets, I think, should be very scary for investors. But with that, and that was a very quick overview, and I'm sorry about that with the time, but I wanted to turn it over to Peter, who has a lot of experience in this area. He was my hero, basically, when I was at the SEC, because there's one thing when you're in government, especially if you want to tow a road that is not down the normally accepted regulatory path in Washington, you can feel very lonely, where people are throwing stones at you, saying you're crazy, why don't you want the government to do X, Y, and Z? But Peter was one of the few voices of the free market on the outside where I could turn to for advice and counsel, and he could always say, well, don't worry, Paul, you're not crazy. But Peter has a long history in Washington, and he started off, believe it or not, as a special assistant and to then Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and then counsel to Vice President Rockefeller when he moved up. And Peter's a lawyer at Rogers & Wells and Gibson Dunn in the past. He was the general counsel of the Treasury Department and White House counsel to Ronald Reagan. So here, coming up with your 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall, I think that's very appropriate. Peter wrote a book about Ronald Reagan, the power of conviction, meaning intellectual conviction and not some other kind of conviction, of course, and the success of his presidency. Peter, way back, he has the right to say, I told you so, with respect to the financial crisis. He wrote a book back in 2004 which summarized all of his battles against Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and how he pointed out the problems of their whole strategy and their role in the economy. And he, I think, probably earned their undying enmity from that. Peter was also on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which had at least good prospects of setting out to try to figure out what exactly did cause the financial crisis. Unfortunately, politics got into the way, and Peter has a forthcoming book now on Dodd-Frank and the problems that Dodd-Frank has caused and the real origins of the financial crisis, and that book will be out here, I hope, by the end of the year. And I hope
first of next year.
First of next year, okay, and that will maybe, if we get a Republican Congress, will maybe guide some of the policy decisions that they may have to make. So with that, let me turn it over to Peter. So.